During the Great Depression, families had to stretch every penny and make the most out of the little they had. Yet they still managed to create filling, delicious meals that kept everyone going. In this video, we're diving into 20 cheap, old-fashioned recipes that helped people survive tough times. Meals that are simple, budget-friendly, and surprisingly tasty. From homemade bread to creative ways to use potatoes and beans, these recipes prove that you don't need fancy ingredients to eat well. Stick around because these Depression-era meals might just save you money today. Let's get cooking. 1. Stone soup, turning nothing into something extraordinary. Growing up, my grandmother used to tell me the story of stone soup, a tale of ingenuity, community, and making something out of nothing. But what I didn't realize until later was that this wasn't just a fable, it was a real survival strategy for families during the Great Depression. When times were tough and food was scarce, people had to get creative. They couldn't afford to waste a single scrap, and that's where stone soup came in. It started with a simple pot of water. Then in went vegetable scraps, onion peels, carrot tops, potato skins, and any wilted greens that might have otherwise been thrown away. If they were lucky, they'd have a soup bone or a bit of meat to add some extra flavor, but even without it, it could transform a few leftovers into a hearty, nourishing meal. The magic of stone soup wasn't just in the recipe itself, but in the way it brought people together. Neighbors would contribute whatever they had, a few beans, an extra potato, or even a handful of rice. What started as a simple pot of water would soon become a rich, flavorful broth that could feed an entire group for mere pennies. Today, food waste is a massive issue. The average American family throws away about $1,500 worth of food per year, often discarding perfectly usable ingredients. By making stone soup, we can reclaim some of that lost value. A modern pot of stone soup costs about $3.50 and feeds up to 8 people, less than 50 cents per serving. Back in the Depression, it was even cheaper, with some families making an entire pot for just 15 cents. I've personally started making my own version of stone soup every week. I keep a container in the freezer where I save up vegetable scraps throughout the week. Carrot ends, celery leaves, onion skins, and even leftover herbs. When the container is full, I simmer everything in a big pot with some water, salt, and spices. The result? A delicious homemade broth that serves as the base for soups, stews, and even rice dishes. By adopting this practice, a household can save up to $125 a month simply by repurposing scraps that would have otherwise gone into the trash. Not only does this help cut down on food waste, but it also makes your grocery budget stretch further. Stone soup is a reminder that even when times are hard, a little creativity can turn what seems like nothing into something truly extraordinary. 2. Hot water cornbread, Southern ingenuity on a plate. If there's one recipe that proves simple food can still be delicious, it's hot water cornbread. This Southern staple was a lifesaver during the Great Depression, providing a warm, filling side dish for just pennies. Unlike regular cornbread, which requires milk, eggs, and baking powder, hot water cornbread strips things down to the absolute essentials: cornmeal, boiling water, and salt. That's it. And yet, these humble ingredients come together to create a crispy, golden patty with a soft, almost creamy center. My grandmother used to tell me that back in the Depression, people made do with whatever they had. If you couldn't afford milk or eggs, you learned to work around it. Boiling water was the secret ingredient that turned simple cornmeal into something that could hold its shape. The technique was simple. Pour hot water over the cornmeal, stir it into a thick batter, shape it into patties, and fry them in a little oil or bacon grease. The result? A crispy, crunchy piece of cornbread that paired perfectly with soups, beans, or just a drizzle of honey. Back then, these cornbread patties cost less than 2 cents each to make. Even today, they remain incredibly budget-friendly. A modern version costs about 25 cents per serving, still significantly cheaper than a loaf of store-bought bread, which can easily run $4.99 or more. Making hot water cornbread at home can also help families save money on bread costs. If you were to replace just a few store-bought loaves with homemade cornbread each month, you could easily save $80 or more. Plus, it takes only 10 minutes to whip up a batch, making it a quick and easy addition to any meal. For me, this recipe is more than just a frugal food. It's a connection to the past, a reminder that sometimes the simplest things are the best. Whenever I make a batch, I feel a little closer to my ancestors who relied on this humble dish to get them through hard times. And honestly, it tastes so good that I'd choose it over regular bread any day. 3. Drop soup, stretching a single egg to feed a family. Egg drop soup is one of those magical recipes that proves you don't need a lot to make something incredibly satisfying. During the Great Depression, when protein was scarce, this soup became a go-to meal for families trying to stretch what little they had. And it all starts with just one egg. This recipe originated from Chinese immigrants who brought it to America, where it quickly gained popularity among struggling families. The concept is simple. Take a pot of seasoned broth, heat it up, then slowly drizzle in a beaten egg while stirring. The egg cooks instantly, creating delicate ribbons that give the soup its signature texture. The result? A warm, filling meal that feels far more luxurious than its humble ingredients suggest. During the Depression, a bowl of egg drop soup cost about 3 cents to make. Even today, it remains one of the most cost-effective meals out there. A single serving costs just $0.45, making it an excellent alternative to expensive meat-heavy dinners. If a modern family were to replace just one meat-based meal per week with egg drop soup, they could save up to $50 a month. One of the best things about this soup is how versatile it is. You can add leftover rice, shredded cabbage, or even frozen vegetables to bulk it up. A drizzle of soy sauce or a pinch of garlic powder adds even more flavor. I like to toss in a handful of green onions and a splash of sesame oil to give it an extra punch. This dish is proof that you don't need a lot of ingredients to create something nourishing. It's quick, easy, and incredibly budget-friendly. Perfect for those nights when you need to whip up something cheap and filling in a hurry. And just like the families who relied on it during the Great Depression, we can still use this recipe today to make our food dollars stretch further. Pour potato soup, creamy richness without cream. If there was one meal that could stretch a few simple ingredients into something hearty and satisfying, it was potato soup. This wasn't the rich, butter-laden soup we think of today, thickened with heavy cream. No, this was Depression-era ingenuity at its finest, turning humble potatoes, water, salt, and a little patience into a silky, comforting dish. My grandmother often told me that this soup was a lifesaver when times were tough. You didn't need fancy ingredients, and you certainly didn't need dairy to make it feel indulgent. The trick was in the cooking. By slow cooking the potatoes, allowing them to break down slightly, the starch released into the broth, creating a natural creaminess without needing milk or cream. Luxuries most families couldn't afford. Back in the 1930s, this soup cost just a nickel per bowl. Today, even with modern grocery prices, you can make a giant pot for under $4, yielding 8 to 10 servings. That's less than 50 cents per bowl. Still a major budget win. But the real savings come when you realize how versatile it is. Families during the Depression knew that no food should ever go to waste. Leftover vegetables, toss them in. Cheese rinds, they melt into the broth, adding depth of flavor. If they were lucky, they'd crumble in a bit of bacon or ham, but even without it, this soup stood strong as a filling meal. I still make this today, especially when I need a budget-friendly meal for the week. It reheats beautifully, making it perfect for meal prep. Just like our grandparents did, modern home cooks can save up to $140 a month by mastering this technique and keeping things simple. 5. Oatmeal meatloaf stretching meat with oats. Meat was a luxury during the Great Depression. If you were lucky enough to have it, you sure weren't going to waste a single bite. That's where oatmeal meatloaf came in. A brilliant way to stretch a single pound of ground beef into a meal big enough to feed the whole family. My great-grandmother swore by this trick. Instead of relying on pricey breadcrumbs, she mixed in hearty oats. Not only did this bulk up the meat mixture, but it also made the meatloaf incredibly tender and moist. The oats absorbed the seasonings and juices, giving every bite a richness that made it taste far more indulgent than it actually was. Back in the Depression, this meatloaf brought meat costs down from 25 cents per serving to just 12 cents. Today, it's still a financial lifesaver. If you compare the cost of a standard meatloaf using store-bought breadcrumbs to one made with oats, you'll save about 50%, cutting the per-person cost from $1.50 to just 75 cents. For a family feeding 4 or more people, that's a huge difference. But the best part? The savings don't stop at dinner. Oatmeal meatloaf leftovers make some of the best sandwiches you'll ever have. A slice between 2 pieces of bread with a little mustard, and you've got a delicious meal for pennies. Some families during the Depression would even crumble the leftover meatloaf into soups or stews to make it last even longer. This simple swap, using oats instead of breadcrumbs, can save modern families up to $100 a month on groceries. Plus, it's healthier. Oats add extra fiber and nutrients, making the meal not only cheaper but also more filling. No wonder it was a Depression-era staple. 6. Scrapple, nose-to-tail eating before it was trendy. These days, people rave about nose-to-tail eating as if it's some new discovery. But the truth is, our grandparents were doing it long before it was fashionable. One of the best examples? Scrapple. This Pennsylvania Dutch dish took the philosophy of waste nothing and turned it into a breakfast staple. Any leftover pork scraps, bits that butchers practically gave away, were boiled down into a rich broth. Cornmeal and spices were added to create a thick, porridge-like mixture. Then it was poured into a loaf pan and chilled until firm. Once set, it was sliced and fried until crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. Scrapple wasn't just a way to use every part of the pig. It was a way to make a little bit of meat go a long way. In the Depression, it cost only 3 cents per serving. Even today, making scrapple at home costs about 60 cents per serving. Still a major bargain compared to expensive breakfast meats like bacon or sausage. My grandfather grew up eating scrapple, and he never stopped. When I was a kid, he'd fry up thick slices and serve them with eggs and toast, telling me how his family used to rely on it when they had nothing else. At the time, I had no idea how valuable those lessons were. Today, if you swap out store-bought bacon for homemade scrapple a few times a month, you can save up to $90 on your grocery bill. Plus, it's packed with protein, making it a great way to start the day on a budget. Scrapple is proof that resourcefulness in the kitchen never goes out of style. If you're willing to step outside your comfort zone, this old-school dish might just become your new favorite breakfast. 7. Baked beans. From pennies to protein-packed meals. Baked beans weren't just a meal during the Great Depression, they were survival food. If there was one dish that could feed a large family for next to nothing while still being packed with protein, it was this. My grandparents swore by their homemade baked beans, and to this day, I make them the same way they did. Slow cooked, with simple ingredients that turn basic beans into a rich, satisfying dish. Navy beans were the go-to choice, not just because they were cheap, but because they could absorb all the incredible flavors of molasses, mustard, and salt pork. Now, if you were lucky enough to have salt pork, you'd get that deep, smoky flavor. But during hard times, plenty of families made do without it and still turned out delicious results. The secret? Time. A 6-hour simmer allowed every flavor to meld together, creating a sauce that, in my opinion, rivals some of the best BBQ joints today. During the Depression, a big pot of baked beans cost only 15 cents and could feed up to 10 people. Even with modern prices, making them from scratch costs around $3. 50 cents for 12 servings? That's just 29 cents per serving. Compare that to store-bought canned baked beans, which can cost up to $2 per can for far fewer servings, and it's easy to see why this dish was a staple. Plus, the savings add up fast. By swapping store-bought beans for homemade, modern families can save around $75 per month. And let's not forget that homemade baked beans pack triple the protein and fiber of their canned counterparts. No wonder this dish has stood the test of time. It's cheap, nutritious, and incredibly satisfying. 8. Caramelized onion and bacon sandwich, elevating cheap ingredients. Sometimes, survival in the kitchen meant knowing how to stretch expensive ingredients while making cheap ones taste luxurious. The caramelized onion and bacon sandwich is a perfect example. My great-grandmother used to say that this sandwich made one piece of bacon taste like 5, and she wasn't wrong. The magic was in the onion. Onions were one of the cheapest vegetables available during the Great Depression, and when cooked low and slow, they transformed into something sweet, rich, and deeply flavorful. Caramelizing onions took patience, but it was well worth it. The trick was to cook them down until they turned a golden brown, releasing their natural sugars and intensifying their flavor. Back in the Depression, families would take just a single strip of bacon, cook it until crispy, and then use the rendered fat to caramelize a big pile of onions. That way, even the smallest amount of bacon could infuse the onions with smoky goodness. The final step was simple: pile the caramelized onions and crispy bacon bits onto toasted bread, and you had a sandwich that felt decadent despite costing just 5 cents at the time. Today, making this sandwich costs around 75 cents, still a fraction of what a standard BLT costs, which can run upwards of $4.50 at a restaurant. For families looking to save money while still enjoying delicious flavors, this method can cut grocery costs by around $60 per month. And honestly, I'd choose a caramelized onion and bacon sandwich over a pricey deli sandwich any day. 9. Fried potato skins, turning trash to treasure. One thing the Great Depression taught people was that food waste wasn't an option. Every scrap, every peel, every bone had value, and nothing went to waste. That's why potato peels, something most people today throw away without a second thought, were turned into one of the most delicious snacks you could imagine. My grandmother always saved her potato peels, and now I do the same. Instead of tossing them, she'd fry them up in a bit of bacon fat or oil, season them with salt, pepper, and dried herbs, and turn them into crispy golden bites of perfection. And let me tell you, they were better than any store-bought potato chip. During the Depression, these crispy skins weren't just a tasty treat. They were a way to make sure not a single bit of food was wasted. What's wild is that today, restaurants charge upwards of $12 for loaded potato skins. Meanwhile, this homemade version still costs mere pennies. Beyond just being a cost-saving snack, potato skins are also packed with nutrients. They contain more fiber, vitamins, and minerals than the potato itself, meaning families during the Depression weren't just stretching their food supply, they were making the most nutritious choice. Modern families can save between $40 and $60 per month just by adopting this simple waste reduction technique. Instead of throwing out peels, why not turn them into a crispy snack or a crunchy topping for soups and salads? It's a no-brainer, and honestly, once you try them, you'll never want to waste a potato peel again. 10. Slumgullion, the everything but the kitchen sink stew. If there was ever a meal that embodied pure survival, it was slumgullion. With a name as scrappy as its ingredients, this one-pot stew was the ultimate way to stretch food when times were tough. My grandparents always had a pot simmering when money was tight, and even today, I find myself making a version of it when I need to clean out my fridge. The beauty of slumgullion is its flexibility. You don't need a recipe, just whatever you have on hand. Leftover beans, toss them in. A lone carrot about to go bad? Chop it up. A handful of noodles or some stale bread? Perfect additions. This stew didn't discriminate. It welcomed meat scraps, wilting vegetables, and even small bits of pasta or rice to bulk it up. During the Great Depression, a big pot of slumgullion cost around 20 cents and could feed up to 12 people. That meant families could stretch their limited groceries and still get a filling, nourishing meal. Today, even with rising food prices, a large pot costs around $5, which is still incredibly budget-friendly when it can provide several meals. The real savings come from reducing food waste. Most people today throw away way more food than they realize. But by adopting the slumgullion mindset, using every edible scrap before it goes bad, modern families can save anywhere from $85 to $100 a month. That's a major financial win, all while enjoying a dish that's as hearty and comforting as anything you'd find in a high-end kitchen. 11. Depression cake, wacky cake / crazy cake. Cake without dairy or eggs. Now, I know what you're thinking. How do you make a cake without butter, milk, or eggs? Sounds impossible, right? But depression cake, also known as wacky cake or crazy cake, proved that you don't need expensive ingredients to bake something delicious. This cake was a little slice of happiness during the hardest of times. And even today, I find myself reaching for this recipe when I want something sweet without breaking the bank. The magic behind depression cake is in its chemistry. Instead of eggs or dairy, vinegar and baking soda provide the lift, while oil keeps everything moist. The result? A rich chocolatey cake that tastes just as indulgent as one made with butter and eggs. My grandmother always said this cake was a lifesaver when rationing was in full force because it allowed families to still enjoy a treat without using up their precious ingredients. Back then, baking a whole cake cost about 15 cents. Today, the ingredients run around $2.50, which is still a bargain when you compare it to store-bought cakes or expensive box mixes. At roughly 31 cents per slice, it's an affordable way to satisfy a sweet tooth without splurging on costly dairy products. Many modern bakers swear by this cake, not just because it's cheap, but because it's accidentally vegan, making it perfect for people with dietary restrictions. And if you make this cake for birthdays, celebrations, or just because you're craving dessert, you could save about $70 a month compared to buying cakes from a bakery. The best part? It tastes just like a regular cake. If you've never tried depression cake, I highly recommend it. You'd never know it was born out of hardship. It just tastes like homemade comfort. 12. Bread pudding, transforming stale bread into dessert. If there's one lesson the Great Depression drilled into people, it was this: never waste bread. Stale, dry bread might seem like trash to some, but to those who knew better, it was an opportunity. Bread pudding was one of the best ways to turn something old into something luxurious. My grandmother never let a loaf go to waste, and neither do I. Bread pudding is essentially a dessert casserole. You take stale bread, soak it in a mixture of milk or water if you didn't have milk, sugar, eggs, and spices, and then bake it until it turns into a soft, custardy dish. Some people added raisins or cinnamon for extra flavor, but even the most basic version tasted like something special. During the Depression, making a pan of bread pudding cost about 18 cents, an absolute steal for a dessert that could feed an entire family. Today, even with modern grocery prices, it only costs around $3 for a full pan, or about 50 cents per serving. That's still significantly cheaper than buying pastries or store-bought desserts, which can easily cost $5 or more for just one slice. By repurposing bread that would otherwise be thrown away, modern families can save up to $65 a month. And honestly, once you try homemade bread pudding, you'll never want to waste bread again. It's warm, comforting, and tastes like something you'd get in a fancy cafe. 13, molasses cookies, nutritional treats on a budget. Growing up, I never thought of cookies as something that could be good for you, but my grandmother sure did. She swore by her molasses cookies, not just because they were cheap to make, but because they were packed with nutrients that helped keep her family strong during hard times. And you know what? She wasn't wrong. Molasses was one of the few sweeteners that remained affordable during the Great Depression, and it turned out to be a powerhouse ingredient. A single cup of molasses contains more iron than 3 servings of spinach, along with calcium, magnesium, and potassium. That made these cookies more than just a treat. They were a practical way to sneak nutrition into the diet of growing kids and hard-working adults. Back in the day, my grandmother could bake a full batch of 24 cookies for just 10 cents. Today, even with rising grocery prices, the cost is still remarkably low, about $2 per batch, which comes out to just $0, 8 cents per cookie. Compare that to store-bought cookies, which can easily cost 50 cents or more per cookie, and the savings add up fast. Families who switch to homemade molasses cookies can easily save $60 or more per. But beyond the savings, these cookies are good. They have a deep, rich flavor thanks to the molasses, and a soft, chewy texture that makes them perfect with a cup of coffee or a glass of milk. Plus, they stay fresh for days, making them a great option for packing in lunches or keeping on hand for a quick snack. 14, rice and raisins, a simple dessert hero. If there was ever a dessert that proved simple is best, it's rice and raisins. My grandmother used to make this for us, and at the time, I didn't appreciate how genius it really was. It's just rice, raisins, a bit of sugar, and sometimes a splash of milk or cinnamon. But somehow, it turns into something comforting and delicious. During the Great Depression, rice and raisins became a staple dessert because both ingredients were cheap, shelf-stable, and easy to find. A whole batch cost about $0.07 and could feed 6 people. Today, you can make the same dish for around $1, 80 cents total, or just $0, 30 cents per serving. That's a fraction of the cost of modern desserts, making it an incredible budget-friendly option. But here's what makes this dish even more special. It's incredibly versatile. Some families made it into a breakfast dish by adding more milk, turning it into a porridge. Others sweetened it up with a bit of brown sugar or honey and served it as dessert. No matter how it was made, it was always filling and satisfying. For modern families, replacing just a few expensive store-bought desserts with this homemade classic can add up to $55 in savings each month. And honestly, once you taste it, you won't feel like you're missing out. The natural sweetness of the raisins, combined with the creaminess of the rice, makes for a treat that feels far more indulgent than it actually is. 15, potato and onion pie, a hearty, meatless main dish. One of the biggest struggles during the Great Depression was finding ways to make meals hearty enough to keep a family full without relying on expensive meats. Enter potato and onion pie, a dish that transformed humble root vegetables into something that felt like a full meal. This pie was a lifesaver for working families. Potatoes were cheap, onions were flavorful, and together they created a dish that was satisfying and filling. The crust was usually made from basic pantry staples: flour, water, and a bit of fat if you had it. But even without a crust, the dish worked beautifully as a baked casserole. Back then, a whole pie cost about $0, 12 cents to make, and could easily feed 8 people. Today, even with inflation, the cost remains low at around $3.50 per pie, or just $0.45 per slice. That's a bargain compared to meat-based meals, which often cost double or triple that amount per serving. Families who add this to their meal rotation can save up to $80 a month just by having one meatless night per week. And the best part? It's absolutely delicious. The slow-cooked onions become sweet and flavorful while the potatoes get soft and creamy inside the crispy crust. My grandmother used to add a sprinkle of cheese if she had any leftovers from another meal. But even on its own, this dish never disappointed. 16. Not eggless pancakes, reinventing breakfast. When I first heard about eggless pancakes, I couldn't believe they could be just as fluffy and delicious as the ones I grew up eating. But after making them myself, I was amazed. They're light, golden, and just as satisfying as traditional pancakes, all without using a single egg. During the Great Depression, eggs were often too expensive for families to afford, so home cooks had to get creative. Instead of eggs, they relied on baking powder and a splash of vinegar to give the pancakes their rise. The result? A breakfast staple that didn't break the bank. Back then, a full batch of these pancakes cost just $0.08 and could feed an entire family of 6. Even today, they remain an affordable breakfast option, costing around $1.20 per batch, or about $0.20 per serving. That's far cheaper than store-bought pancake mixes, and certainly less expensive than a trip to a diner. Families who swap expensive restaurant breakfasts for homemade eggless pancakes can save up to $70 per month. The beauty of this recipe is its versatility. You can eat them plain, drizzle them with honey or syrup, or even top them with whatever fruit you have on hand. Some people stretch the recipe even further by adding mashed bananas or shredded zucchini to sneak in extra nutrients. No matter how you serve them, eggless pancakes prove that great food doesn't have to be complicated or expensive. 17. Johnny Cakes, Native American wisdom meets necessity. Johnny Cakes have been around for centuries, but during the Great Depression, they became a lifesaver for struggling families. Made with simple cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, these flatbreads were a cheap, filling alternative to traditional bread. This recipe has deep roots in Native American cooking. Long before the Depression, indigenous tribes relied on Johnny Cakes as a staple, and their knowledge of how to stretch simple ingredients helped countless families survive hard times. With wheat flour sometimes too expensive or unavailable, cornmeal became the go-to option. It was cheap, stored well, and could be transformed into a warm, comforting meal with just a bit of water and heat. Back in the Depression era, a batch of Johnny Cakes cost just $0.06 and could feed 8 people. Even today, they remain incredibly affordable, with a full batch costing around $1.50 or about $0.19 per serving. That's a fraction of the cost of store-bought bread, which can easily run $3 or more per loaf. By making Johnny Cakes instead of buying expensive baked goods, families can save up to $65 per month. These simple cornmeal cakes are surprisingly delicious. Crisp on the outside and soft on the inside, they pair well with butter, jam, or even a drizzle of honey. Some people serve them with beans or stew for a heartier meal, while others enjoy them as a quick breakfast. No matter how they're eaten, Johnny Cakes prove that a little bit of resourcefulness can go a long way. 18. Biscuits and gravy, turning kitchen scraps into breakfast gold. Biscuits and gravy might be considered comfort food today, but during the Great Depression, it was a necessity. This dish was born out of the need to make something hearty and filling out of whatever scraps were available. And let me tell you, it worked. Biscuits were made using the most basic pantry staples: flour, baking powder, lard, or butter if you were lucky. The gravy, that came from drippings left over from cooking meat or bacon, a little bit of milk or water, some flour to thicken it, and suddenly a simple meal became something that could sustain a family for hours. Back then, this meal cost just $0, 11 cents to feed 6 people. Today, even with rising grocery prices, homemade biscuits and gravy still come out to just $2.80 for a full batch, or about $0.47 per serving. That's an incredible bargain compared to restaurant prices, where a single plate of biscuits and gravy can easily cost $8 or more. By mastering this technique, families can save up to $90 a month. What makes this dish special is its adaptability. If meat drippings weren't available, families would make a simple gravy with flour, milk, and a bit of salt and pepper. Some added crumbled sausage or leftover bits of ham when they had them. Others stretched the biscuits further by serving them with butter and jam for breakfast, or pairing them with beans for dinner. No matter how you prepare it, biscuits and gravy remind us that sometimes the best meals come from making the most of what you already have. That's a lesson worth remembering even today. 19. Potato pancakes. crispy cultural staple. Potato pancakes have been around for generations, crossing cultural boundaries and feeding families through the toughest times. Whether you call them latkes, plake, or just crispy potato goodness, they became a Depression-era staple because they turned the humblest ingredients, potatoes, flour, and a little salt, into a meal that felt indulgent. My grandmother used to tell me stories about making these during the Great Depression. With money tight and meat often too expensive, potatoes became the backbone of many meals. She'd grate them by hand, mix them with just enough flour to hold them together, and fry them up in whatever fat was available. Lard, butter, or even just a thin layer of oil. The result? Golden, crispy pancakes that were filling, cheap, and could be served for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Back then, a full batch of these potato pancakes cost about $0.09 and could feed 8 people. Today, even with rising food costs, a batch still comes out to about $2.50 total, or just $0.31 per serving. That's a fraction of the price of frozen hash browns or restaurant-style potato dishes. Families who embrace this simple recipe can save up to $75 per month by using potatoes as a budget-friendly alternative to other starchy sides. Potato pancakes are also incredibly versatile. They can be topped with applesauce for a touch of sweetness, sour cream for richness, or even paired with eggs for a more complete meal. And if you ever have leftover mashed potatoes, you can use those instead of grated potatoes to make an even quicker version. No matter how you prepare them, potato pancakes prove that sometimes the simplest meals are the most satisfying. 20. Cornmeal mush, 1 ingredient, 3 distinct meals. Cornmeal mush might not sound fancy, but during the Great Depression, it was a lifesaver. Made with just cornmeal, water, and a little salt, it was one of the most versatile dishes a family could make, stretching a single ingredient across multiple meals. I remember my great-grandmother making this when I was a child. She'd start the day by cooking up a big pot of mush, stirring it constantly over the stove until it thickened into a creamy porridge-like consistency. That would be breakfast, served hot with a little butter, sugar, or